I'm pleased to stand here today in full support of this bill because, honestly, when I hear the debate on this bill and I read this bill, and we've heard from so many constituents about this bill, I can't help but think that our families can be stronger when we care for one another, that our economy can be stronger when we care for one another, and quite honestly, even in this chamber and the work we do can be stronger when we recognize each other as more human and care for one another. In Connecticut as a state, we should be a state that values that care that we show for one another and that we show for our families and loved ones. Everyone in this state deserves access to caring for themselves or a loved one and not have to worry about the choice of providing that care for themselves or a loved one and their livelihood. When I thought about showing up today, I really actually thought about a recent conversation that I had over the dinner table with my father. Because my father, although now retired and hitting nearly 74 years old, my father is someone, just like many of our own family members in this chamber, that had many jobs over his lifetime that did not provide a single day of paid sick leave. My dad, I'd like to think of, is a true master of all trades. In those 74 years of his life, he's actually had over 70 different jobs. And that's because he's been everything from a school bus driver to a night auditor to a guitar builder to a golf course maintenance worker. And he did all of those jobs to support my mom and me. And there was any number of occasions in his life, in his hard work, where he would be sick or he would be injured. And because he didn't have access to a paid sick day, he would still go to work, even though he was sick, even though he was injured. And I think of him today when we're talking about this bill because so many of our family and friends are still making this choice here in Connecticut. They're making this choice to have to go to work sick or have to go to work injured because they don't have access to that single paid sick day, just like my dad. Now, the law we have in front of us today does affect every worker in our state. But we know from the research that it predominantly will affect and uplift the women of the state of Connecticut. Because the women, especially women of color in our state of Connecticut, are most likely to not have access to a single paid sick day. It's not lost on me that in this chamber that is most underrepresented with women of color, that we are talking about a bill that would predominantly affect women of color across our state. And this is a bill that won't just support women of color, but support their families. Because in our state, sadly, nearly 40% of our families, primarily women-headed households, cannot make ends meet. And so those are the families who cannot make that choice right now about being sick or going to work because they have to go to work. I think it's critical that we also remind ourselves of what we went through together just a few years ago in going through a pandemic and recognizing how pivotal it was about having access to paid sick time. No, we're not, thankfully, due to all of our hard work, in the midst of a pandemic today, but we know that sickness spreads in workplaces, public health outbreaks spread in workplaces, and workers themselves cannot get access to health care for themselves or their children without access to paid sick days. Finally, I think it's worth noting that in the past 2 years, we did really step up as a state to pass a really pivotal law to establish paid family medical leave here in the state of Connecticut. And I have to say, in hearing the conversation today, we heard many similar concerns in passing paid family medical leave just a few years ago of the effect on businesses. But what we've seen from the success of that program, over 100,000 workers across the state who've been able to care for themselves or a loved one, to keep their jobs and to keep our economy strong, we can see that the research bears out here in Connecticut for paid family medical leave, and it'll do the same for all of our workers to have access to paid sick days. Because when workers can care for themselves, that means that they can show up to work, they can retain that job, and they can keep contributing to our economy. So again, I want to thank the proponent and my colleagues for the rich discussion today, but I really ask us, who do we want to be? And I hope it's a state and a community and a chamber that cares for our own family members that we've seen struggle without access to paid sick days, and to be a state that recognizes that when we pass this bill, we will have healthier families, we will have more economically strong families, and we will have a stronger state overall. Thank you, Madam Speaker.